The fluorescent lights of Jefferson County Courthouse hummed with an electric buzz that seemed to vibrate through Emma Matthews' small bones. She sat perfectly still on a wooden bench that was far too large for her 7-year-old frame, her legs dangling several inches above the cold marble floor. Her feet, clad in new black Mary Janes that her foster mother had bought just 3 days ago, swung slightly, the only indication that she was a living, breathing child and not a porcelain doll placed carefully on display. 9 months. It had been 9 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days since Emma had spoken a single word. Mrs. Chen, her foster mother, sat beside her with a protective arm draped across Emma's thin shoulders. The woman's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed down a stubborn cowlick in Emma's honey blonde hair. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen whispered, though her voice cracked with uncertainty. "You don't have to be afraid." But Emma was afraid, terrified actually. Down the hallway, somewhere behind those imposing oak doors with brass handles, he was waiting. Michael Harrison, the man who had stolen everything from her, the man who had turned her world into ash and smoke and screaming that never seemed to stop echoing in her nightmares. Emma's hands clenched into tiny fists in her lap, wrinkling the blue cotton dress that Mrs. Chen had insisted made her look brave and strong. She didn't feel brave. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was drowning in invisible water, unable to breathe, unable to scream, unable to do anything but sink deeper and deeper into a silence that had become both her prison and her protection. The courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past, their leather shoes clicking authoritatively against the floor. A bailiff spoke quietly into his radio. Somewhere nearby, a woman sobbed softly. Emma registered it all from very far away, as if she were watching through a thick pane of glass that separated her from the rest of the world. "Emma," a gentle voice broke through her fog. Detective Sarah Rodriguez knelt down in front of her, her kind brown eyes level with Emma's vacant blue ones. Sarah had been the first person Emma saw after the firefighters pulled her from the smoke-filled closet where she'd hidden for 47 minutes, breathing through a wet towel, praying that the monster wouldn't find her. Sarah had wrapped her in a blanket, held her in the ambulance, and promised her that she was safe now. But Emma hadn't believed her then, and she didn't believe her now. "I brought someone special to see you," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a note of hope that made Mrs. Chen lean forward eagerly. That's when Emma noticed him. A German shepherd, massive and dignified, sat perfectly still beside Detective Rodriguez. His coat was a rich mixture of black and tan, his ears stood at attention, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. He wore a vest that read Police K9 Therapy Dog in bold white letters. "This is Duke," Sarah explained, her hand resting gently on the dog's head. "He's my partner, but he's also trained to help kids who have been through really scary things. He's been wanting to meet you, Emma. Is it okay if he says hello?" For the first time in months, something flickered behind Emma's eyes. Not quite hope, not quite interest, but something. A tiny spark in the darkness. Mrs. Chen held her breath. Sarah made a small hand gesture and Duke stood slowly, moving with careful deliberation toward Emma. He didn't rush, didn't jump, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply walked forward until he was close enough for Emma to touch, then sat again, waiting patiently for her permission. Emma stared at the dog. Duke stared back, his expression calm and somehow understanding, as if he could see all the broken pieces inside her and wasn't frightened by them at all. Slowly, so slowly that Mrs. Chen barely dared to breathe, Emma's right hand unclenched. Her small fingers extended, trembling, toward Duke's head. The moment her fingertips touched his soft fur, something extraordinary happened. Emma's rigid posture softened just slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened. And for the first time since that horrible night in March, the constant trembling that plagued her body eased. Duke leaned gently into her touch, offering his presence like a gift with no strings attached. He didn't need her to speak, didn't need her to explain. He simply existed beside her, solid and warm and real. He visits children at the hospital and courthouse, Sarah explained quietly. Kids who have been through trauma. He's helped a lot of people, Emma, and I think maybe he can help you too. Emma's fingers moved deeper into Duke's fur, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion of petting him. For 9 months, she'd felt completely alone, trapped in a nightmare that no one else could understand. But this dog, this gentle, patient creature, seemed to understand perfectly. Emma, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I know you can't talk right now. I know that what you saw was so terrible that words can't express it. But today, in that courtroom, we need you to try. Michael Harrison hurt you and your family, and you're the only one who can tell the truth about what happened. Emma's hand stilled on Duke's head. Fear flooded back through her like ice water. But here's the thing, Sarah added quickly, Duke can come with you, right into the courtroom, right up to the witness stand. He'll be there the whole time and you can hold on to him whenever you need to. Would that help? Emma looked into Duke's eyes. The dog gazed back with infinite patience, as if to say, I'll protect you. You're not alone anymore. And for the first time in 9 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, Emma felt the tiniest flicker of something she'd thought was gone forever. Hope. The courthouse doors opened. A bailiff stepped out. They're ready for Emma Matthews. Mrs. Chen stood, her hand extended toward Emma. Sarah rose too, Duke remaining seated beside the little girl. It was time. Emma took one more deep breath, her fingers still buried in Duke's fur. Then, with the dog walking calmly at her side, she stood and walked toward the courtroom doors, toward justice, toward truth, and toward the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could find her voice again. The trial was about to begin. Judge Margaret Thornton had presided over Jefferson County's Superior Court for 23 years. In that time, she'd seen everything, or so she thought. Murder trials, corruption cases, custody battles that turned families into war zones. She'd maintained order through outbursts, breakdowns, and even one memorable occasion when a defendant tried to flee through a second-story window. Nothing surprised her anymore. Until today. She sat in her chambers, reading glasses perched on her nose, staring at the most unusual motion she'd encountered in her entire legal career. The prosecution was requesting that a police dog, an actual German shepherd, be allowed to sit with the child witness during testimony. This is insane, she muttered, flipping through the attached psychological evaluations for the 3rd time. Her clerk, David, hovered nervously by the door. The attorneys are getting restless, Your Honor. Defense is threatening to file an emergency appeal if you allow it. Margaret ignored him, her eyes scanning the report from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the child psychologist who'd been working with Emma Matthews since the night of the fire. The words painted a devastating picture. Patient exhibits severe selective mutism, PTSD, and dissociative symptoms. She has not spoken since the night of March 15th. Traditional therapy approaches have yielded minimal progress. However, patient shows remarkable responsiveness to K9 therapy sessions with police dog Duke. Heart rate stabilizes, cortisol levels decrease, and patient demonstrates nonverbal communication she refuses with human interaction. In my professional opinion, testifying without this support system would be not only traumatic but potentially impossible. Margaret set down the papers and removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Through her window, she could see the courthouse lawn where news vans had already begun to gather. The Harrison case had attracted media attention from across the state. A respected insurance adjuster accused of murdering his business partner and the man's wife, then burning their house to cover his tracks, with their 7-year-old daughter inside. It was the kind of story that dominated headlines. And that little girl was the prosecution's entire case. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Your Honor, they really need a decision, David pressed. Send in the attorneys, both of them." 5 minutes later, Assistant District Attorney James Park stood on one side of her desk, while Defense Attorney Richard Morgan occupied the other. The tension between them was palpable. Morgan spoke first, his voice sharp with indignation. "Your Honor, this is completely unprecedented. A police dog in a criminal trial. It's prejudicial, it's inflammatory, and it will absolutely bias the jury against my client. The moment they see a child clinging to a police dog, they'll assume she's terrified of Mr. Harrison." "She is terrified of your client," Park interrupted, his normally calm demeanor cracking, "because she watched him murder her parents." "Alleged murder," Morgan shot back. "My client maintains his innocence, and he has the right to a fair trial, a trial where the jury isn't emotionally manipulated by." "Gentlemen," Margaret's voice cut through the argument like a blade. Both lawyers fell silent immediately. "Mr. Park, I understand your position, but Mr. Morgan raises valid concerns. The presence of a police dog could indeed influence the jury's perception." Park stepped forward, desperation evident in his eyes. "Your Honor, without Duke, Emma can't testify, and without her testimony we have no case. The physical evidence is circumstantial. The financial motive is clear but not definitive. Emma is our only eyewitness." He pulled out another document. "I've consulted with 3 child advocacy organizations and 2 legal precedents from other states where comfort animals were permitted. Those cases involved stuffed animals and support persons," Morgan interjected. "Not police dogs. The very designation police dog creates an association with law enforcement that prejudices." "Duke is certified as a therapy animal," Park countered. "He works with traumatized children at Denver Children's Hospital. His police designation is secondary to his therapeutic function." Margaret held up her hand for silence. She walked to her window, looking down at the courthouse entrance where she could see Sarah Rodriguez standing with Emma and her foster mother. Even from this distance, she could see the child's rigid posture, the way she seemed to fold in on herself. And beside her, the German shepherd sat perfectly still, a calm presence in the chaos. "Mr. Morgan," Margaret said slowly, "if I allow this, what accommodations would make it acceptable to the defense?" Morgan's jaw tightened. "None, Your Honor. I would object regardless." "But hypothetically," Margaret pressed, "for the sake of argument." The defense attorney was silent for a long moment, clearly strategizing. "The dog would have to be positioned where the jury cannot see it clearly. No police vest or identification. And I would need the right to voir dire the detective about any potential coaching or influence." Park opened his mouth to object, but Margaret silenced him with a look. "Here's my decision," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of her 2 decades on the bench. "The dog will be allowed, but with conditions. Duke will sit at Emma's feet, behind the witness stand partition where the jury's view is obstructed. He will not wear his police vest, just a plain harness. Detective Rodriguez will remain in the courtroom but at the back, unless her presence is specifically needed. Mr. Morgan, you may question the detective about training and protocols, but you will not harass a traumatized child in the process. Are we clear?" Both attorneys started speaking at once. "Your Honor, I must object," Morgan began. "This is acceptable," Park said simultaneously. "I don't care if it's acceptable," Margaret interrupted, her voice steel. "This is my courtroom and this is my ruling. Mr. Morgan, you can file your appeal, but it won't be heard before this trial concludes. We have a jury waiting, and we have a child who deserves the opportunity to tell her story." She fixed both men with a hard stare. "That little girl spent 47 minutes hiding in a closet while her home burned around her and her parents died. She's 7 years old and she hasn't spoken in 9 months. If a therapy dog is what it takes for her to communicate, then that's what we'll provide. The law exists to serve justice, gentlemen, not the other way around." Morgan's face flushed red. "Your Honor, I'll be filing a formal objection for the record." "So noted. Anything else?" "This is a travesty." Mr. Morgan, Margaret's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. In my 23 years on this bench, I have bent over backward to ensure fair trials. I have protected defendants' rights even when it made me unpopular. But I have also learned that justice sometimes requires creativity. Now, we have a courtroom full of people waiting, and we have a child who needs to testify. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back out there, you're going to make your objection for the record, and then we're going to proceed. Understood? The defense attorney's jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. Good, we reconvene in 10 minutes. David, bring me some water. This is going to be a long day. As the attorneys filed out, Margaret returned to her window. She watched Emma standing in the hallway, her small hand resting on Duke's head, and felt a weight settle on her shoulders. This decision could be appealed. It could be overturned. Legal scholars might debate it for years. But looking at that traumatized child, Margaret knew she'd made the right call. Sometimes justice required breaking the rules. She straightened her robes and headed for the courtroom. It was time to make history. The courtroom of Judge Margaret Thornton was built in 1962, designed with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that gave it an air of gravitas and authority. Normally, it buzzed with the controlled chaos of legal proceedings, lawyers shuffling papers, court reporters typing steadily, spectators whispering among themselves. But at precisely 9:47 a.m. on this Tuesday morning, as the bailiff opened the heavy oak doors, the room fell into a silence so complete that people could hear their own heartbeats. Emma Matthews was coming in. Every head turned toward the entrance. The jury, 12 men and women who'd been selected over 3 painstaking days, leaned forward in their seats. The gallery, packed with journalists, victims' advocates, and curious citizens who'd lined up at dawn for a seat, collectively held their breath. Even the court reporter's fingers stilled above her stenography machine. Detective Sarah Rodriguez entered first, her posture military straight, her face carefully neutral. Beside her walked Duke, the German shepherd moving with the disciplined grace of his training. His police vest had been removed as per the judge's orders, replaced with a simple blue harness. But there was no mistaking what he was: the intelligence in his eyes, the confident way he carried himself, the alertness in every muscle spoke of a working dog with a purpose. And clinging to Duke's harness with one small, trembling hand was Emma. The child looked impossibly tiny in the cavernous courtroom. Her blue dress seemed to swallow her fragile frame. Her blonde hair had been carefully combed and pinned back with a small butterfly clip, a touch added by Mrs. Chen that morning in a desperate attempt to make her feel pretty, brave, anything other than terrified. But Emma's face was colorless, her eyes fixed on the floor, her entire body rigid with fear. Sarah guided them slowly down the center aisle, past the prosecution table where Ada James Park stood with his hands clasped tightly together, past the defense table where Michael Harrison sat perfectly still, his expensive suit pressed and immaculate, his graying hair neatly trimmed, his expression one of carefully constructed concern. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like a worried family friend, saddened by the tragedy that had befallen the Matthews family. His lawyer had coached him well: look sympathetic, not threatening. Look innocent. But as Emma passed within 10 feet of him, her step faltered. Duke immediately stopped, pressing his solid weight against Emma's leg. The girl's breathing had become rapid, shallow, her eyes wide with panic even though she still hadn't looked up. Sarah knelt down quickly, whispering something in Emma's ear that no one else could hear. Whatever she said, it was enough. Emma's grip on Duke's harness tightened until her knuckles turned white, but she kept moving. The journey to the witness stand, no more than 30 feet, seemed to take an eternity. Judge Thornton watched from her elevated bench, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp. She'd seen trauma before, seen victims struggle to testify, but something about this child's absolute terror made her chest tighten. Margaret had a granddaughter Emma's age. The thought of that bright, chattering little girl reduced to this silent, trembling shadow of a child made her grip her gavel harder than necessary. Finally, they reached the witness stand. It had been modified that morning. A step stool added so Emma could climb up, a cushion placed on the chair so she could see over the partition. Sarah helped her up gently while Duke positioned himself at the base of the stand, just out of the jury's direct line of sight but close enough that Emma could see him, could reach down and touch him if needed. The bailiff approached with a children's Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Emma stared at the Bible, unmoving. "She can nod," Judge Thornton said quietly. "Emma, if you understand and agree to tell the truth, you can nod your head." After several long seconds, Emma's head moved in the smallest possible nod. "Let the record show the witness has been sworn," Margaret announced. "Mr. Park, you may proceed." Ada James Park approached the witness stand with the care of someone navigating a minefield. He'd prosecuted hundreds of cases, questioned countless witnesses, but he'd never felt pressure like this. Everything, the entire case, justice for the Matthews family, his career, rested on whether this traumatized child could communicate what she'd witnessed. "Good morning, Emma," he began, his voice gentle and warm. "My name is Mr. Park and I'm here to help you tell your story. Is that okay?" Silence. Emma's eyes remained fixed on Duke. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair so tightly that her fingers trembled. Park tried again. "Emma, I know this is scary, but everyone here wants to listen to you. Can you tell us your full name?" "Nothing." In the jury box, a middle-aged woman in the front row, juror number 3, a schoolteacher, felt tears prick her eyes. Beside her, juror number 7, a retired contractor, shifted uncomfortably. They'd all been told about Emma's condition, about her selective mutism, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. "Emma," Park continued, his voice remaining patient despite the growing tension in the room, "do you remember the night of March 15th? The night of the fire?" Emma flinched visibly. Duke immediately stood, his head level with her dangling feet, offering his presence. Emma's right hand dropped down, fingers finding his soft fur, but she still didn't speak. Park glanced back at his co-counsel, then at Judge Thornton, uncertainty flickering across his face. He'd prepared for this possibility, but he'd hoped, he'd hoped, that being here with Duke's support would be enough. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "may I have a moment?" "Proceed, Counselor." Park pulled out a set of picture cards, a technique Dr. Morrison had suggested. Images of a house, a family, a calendar. "Emma, you don't have to speak out loud. Can you point to the picture that shows your house, where you lived with your mom and dad?" Emma's eyes flickered toward the cards, then away. Her breathing grew more rapid. Duke whined softly, a sound of concern. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Park tried every approach he'd prepared. Simple yes or no questions that Emma could nod to, pictures she could point at, even offering to let her write her answers. But Emma remained frozen, locked in a silence so absolute it seemed to have physical weight. In the gallery, Mrs. Chen pressed a tissue to her eyes. Sarah Rodriguez, standing at the back of the courtroom, felt her heart breaking. They'd worked so hard to get Emma to this point, and now. "Your Honor," defense attorney Richard Morgan stood, his voice cutting through the tension. "I hate to interrupt, but it's been 15 minutes. The witness is clearly unable to testify. I move to—" "Sit down, Mr. Morgan," Judge Thornton said sharply. "We'll proceed at the witness's pace." But even as she said it, Margaret felt doubt creeping in. She looked at Emma, truly looked at her, and saw a child drowning in trauma, unable to reach the surface no matter how hard she tried. The girl's entire body shook now, her breathing erratic, her eyes squeezed shut as if she could will herself to disappear. 20 minutes, 25. Park was running out of options. The jury was growing restless. Harrison's lawyer was preparing another motion, and Emma sat frozen in the witness stand, locked in a prison of her own terror. The case was slipping away. Judge Thornton leaned forward, her voice soft. "Emma, sweetheart, we can take a break if you need." And that's when Duke did something extraordinary. The German shepherd, who had been sitting perfectly still at the base of the witness stand, suddenly stood. His ears perked forward, his head tilted slightly to the side, and he made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, but a soft, questioning noise that seemed to say, "I'm listening. I hear you." Emma's eyes opened. Her trembling hand, still gripping the edge of her chair, slowly released. And then, so slowly that at first no one noticed, her fingers began to move. They moved through the air once, twice, 3 times. Then Emma's hand dropped down to Duke's head and her fingers began tracing patterns through his fur. Deliberate patterns, purposeful movements. At the back of the courtroom, Sarah Rodriguez's eyes widened in sudden, electric recognition. "Your Honor," her voice cracked with urgency. "Stop, she's communicating. Emma is signing, she's using sign language." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had seen many things in her 12 years with the Denver Police Department. She'd walked into crime scenes that haunted her dreams. She'd notified families of deaths that shattered their worlds. She'd faced down armed suspects and talked suicidal teenagers off ledges. But she'd never moved as fast as she did in that moment, practically running down the center aisle of Judge Thornton's courtroom. "Your Honor, please, Emma is signing. She's using American Sign Language." Every head whipped toward Sarah. Judge Thornton's gavel, which she'd been raising to restore order, froze midair. Ada Park spun around, his expression shifting from defeat to confusion to desperate hope in the span of a heartbeat. "What?" he breathed. Sarah reached the witness stand, her eyes locked on Emma's small hand moving through Duke's fur. The movements were slow, deliberate, methodical. Not the random petting of a nervous child, but something purposeful, something intentional. Emma's fingers traced patterns. A closed fist opening, fingers moving in specific directions, hand shapes that meant something to those who knew how to read them. "She's signing," Sarah repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Morrison mentioned in her reports that Emma's therapist has been teaching her basic ASL as an alternative communication method. I didn't think, we never considered." She looked up at Judge Thornton, her eyes blazing with urgency. "Your Honor, I'm fluent in American Sign Language. I learned it working with deaf community outreach programs. Emma is telling us what happened. She's been trying to tell us this whole time." The courtroom erupted. Defense attorney Morgan shot to his feet. "Objection! This is highly irregular. We can't just suddenly change." Overruled. Judge Thornton's gavel finally came down with a crack that silenced everyone. Her mind was racing, legal precedents and procedures clashing with the extraordinary situation unfolding before her. "Mr. Morgan, sit down. Everyone be quiet." She turned to Sarah, her voice sharp with focus. "Detective Rodriguez, are you absolutely certain the child is using sign language?" "Yes, Your Honor, look." Sarah gestured to Emma, whose hand continued its deliberate movements through Duke's fur. "See how her fingers form specific shapes? That's the sign for night. And that," Emma's hand moved again, "that's fire. She's not just petting the dog, she's communicating." Margaret leaned forward, studying Emma intently. The child's eyes were still downcast, her body still rigid with fear, but her hand moved with unmistakable purpose. After 9 months of silence, Emma Matthews had found a voice, just not the one anyone expected. "This is absurd," Morgan insisted, his face reddening. "We can't verify this. How do we know the detective isn't just making things up? This could be complete fabrication." "Are you suggesting," Judge Thornton said coldly, "that Detective Rodriguez would commit perjury in my courtroom?" "I'm suggesting this entire situation is unprecedented and impossible to authenticate," Morgan shot back. "ASL requires both hands for many signs. How can she properly sign while touching a dog? This is—" "Your Honor," Park interrupted, stepping forward with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Morrison's most recent report mentions that Emma has been learning tactile signing. a modified form of ASL that can be performed with one hand or even through touch. It's sometimes used with deaf-blind individuals. He rifled through his papers, finding the page. Here, patient shows particular affinity for tactile communication, using touch-based signing with therapy animals as a comfort mechanism. We just never thought she'd use it here. Judge Thornton's fingers drummed on her bench. Every instinct honed by 23 years on the bench told her this was dangerous legal territory. Unprecedented, potentially grounds for appeal. But looking at Emma, really seeing her for the first time, Margaret recognized something profound happening. The child who couldn't speak was finally, desperately, trying to tell her story. "Bailiff," Margaret said decisively, "clear the courtroom. Everyone out except essential personnel. I'm calling a 30-minute recess." "Your Honor, I must protest," Morgan began. "You can protest all you want, counselor, but right now I need to figure out how to handle this situation legally and appropriately." "Bailiff, clear the room. Jury, please return to the deliberation room. Detective Rodriguez and Mr. Park remain. Mr. Morgan, you too." The next 20 minutes were the most intense of Margaret Thornton's judicial career. In her chambers with both attorneys present, she pulled every relevant law book she could find. Sarah stood by with Emma, who had refused to let go of Duke, while Mrs. Chen waited anxiously outside. The lawyers argued back and forth, their voices rising and falling in heated debate. "There's precedent for interpreters," Park argued, spreading papers across Margaret's desk. "Court-appointed interpreters for witnesses who don't speak English, for deaf witnesses, for witnesses with speech impediments." "But those are standard accommodations," Morgan countered. "This is a child using modified sign language through a dog. How can we possibly verify accuracy? How can I cross-examine effectively when I can't even see the signs clearly? This violates my client's Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses." "She's 7 years old and traumatized," Park's voice cracked. "Are we really going to let Harrison walk because Emma's communication method is unusual?" "Unusual?" Morgan's laugh was bitter. "Counselor, this isn't unusual, it's unprecedented. No appeals court will uphold a conviction based on testimony we can't independently verify." Margaret listened to both sides, her legal mind working through the implications. Morgan was right. This was unprecedented. But Park was also right. Letting Harrison walk because Emma couldn't communicate in a traditional way seemed like a profound injustice. She turned to Sarah, who had been watching Emma the entire time. The child sat in a corner chair, her hand still moving through Duke's fur in slow, deliberate patterns. "Detective Rodriguez," Margaret said, "can you tell me what she's signing right now?" Sarah watched Emma carefully. "She's signing scared, over and over, scared, scared, scared." Margaret's chest tightened. She thought of her own granddaughter, safe at home with her parents. She thought of justice, of fairness, of a legal system designed to protect the vulnerable. She made her decision. "Here's what we're going to do," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Detective Rodriguez will serve as an ASL interpreter for Emma's testimony. She'll stand beside the witness stand and translate the signs Emma makes. Mr. Morgan, you'll have the right to question Detective Rodriguez about her qualifications and to observe Emma's signs yourself. We'll have a video recording made of Emma's hands for potential review. And I'll allow an independent ASL expert to observe and verify if you can find one within the next hour." "Your Honor," Morgan started. "This is my ruling, counselor. You can appeal it, but we're proceeding today. That child has been waiting 9 months for justice. We're not making her wait any longer." When the courtroom reconvened 45 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted from curious anticipation to electric tension. Word had spread through the courthouse corridors, then leaked to the reporters outside. A child witness was going to testify using sign language through a dog. Legal experts were already being called for commentary. Court TV was requesting live broadcast rights. This was the kind of moment that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. Judge Margaret Thornton entered through her chamber's door, her black robe seeming heavier than usual. She'd spent the last 10 minutes alone, reviewing her decision one final time, knowing that whatever happened next would define her legacy on the bench. She could play it safe, declare Emma unable to testify, and watch a likely murderer walk free. Or she could take a leap into uncharted legal territory and pray the appeals courts would understand. She'd made her choice. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The courtroom stood as one. In the jury box, 12 citizens who'd been pulled from their ordinary lives watched with rapt attention. In the gallery, every seat was filled, journalists with notebooks poised, sketch artists already drawing the scene. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. And at the witness stand, Emma Matthews sat frozen, her small hand resting on Duke's head. The German shepherd sat like a statue, his dark eyes alert, his presence radiating calm. Detective Sarah Rodriguez stood nearby, her posture military straight, her face composed despite the chaos of emotions she felt inside. At the defense table, Michael Harrison sat with carefully constructed composure, but those who looked closely could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against the table before his lawyer shot him a warning look. Judge Thornton settled into her chair and surveyed her courtroom. The weight of 200 years of legal precedent pressed down on her shoulders. "Be seated," she said. The room sat. Margaret cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the absolute authority of her office. "We are here in the matter of the People versus Michael James Harrison. Before we proceed with testimony, I need to address an extraordinary situation that has developed." She paused, letting the words settle. The witness, Emma Matthews, age 7, has been unable to speak since the traumatic events of March 15th of this year. This court was initially advised that she might be able to testify with the support of a therapy dog, which I permitted over defense objection. However, it has now become clear that Emma is communicating through American Sign Language, specifically, a tactile form of signing performed through contact with her support animal. Morgan half rose from his seat. "Your Honor." "Mr. Morgan, you'll have your chance to speak," Margaret said firmly. "Right now, I'm making my ruling, and everyone in this courtroom is going to listen." The defense attorney sat back down, his expression dark. Margaret continued, her words measured and deliberate. "I have consulted the relevant case law. While there is no direct precedent for this specific situation, there are numerous cases supporting the use of interpreters for witnesses who cannot communicate in conventional ways. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. Emma's selective mutism, caused by severe trauma, qualifies as such a disability." She looked directly at the jury. Detective Sarah Rodriguez is fluent in American Sign Language. She has provided proof of her certification and her experience working with deaf and hard-of-hearing community members for over 8 years. She will serve as Emma's interpreter during this testimony. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Margaret's gavel came down once sharply, and silence returned. "Here are the conditions," she announced. "Detective Rodriguez will stand beside the witness stand where both the jury and attorneys can observe her translations. A video camera will record Emma's hand movements for the official court record. Mr. Morgan, you may question Detective Rodriguez about her qualifications and may request clarification of any signs you don't understand." Additionally, she nodded to the bailiff, who opened the courtroom door, "I have arranged for Professor Linda Chen from the University of Colorado's ASL Studies Department to observe and verify the translations. Professor Chen is a deaf advocate and ASL expert with no connection to this case. She will be present to ensure accuracy." A woman in her 50s entered, using a wheelchair, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She positioned herself where she could clearly see both Emma and Detective Rodriguez. Morgan stood again, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Your Honor, I must object in the strongest possible terms. This accommodation is so far beyond reasonable that it borders on absurd. My client has a constitutional right to confront his accuser. How can he do that when the accuser is communicating through an animal? How can I effectively cross-examine when I can't even see the signs being made? This entire proceeding is a mockery of—" "Mr. Morgan," Judge Thornton's voice cut like ice, "I have heard your objections. They are noted for the record, but let me be very clear about something. This court exists to serve justice, not convenience, not tradition, justice." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into the defense attorney. "That child witnessed her parents being murdered. She survived by hiding in a closet for nearly an hour while her home burned around her. She is 7 years old, and she has not spoken a single word in 9 months because of the trauma inflicted upon her. Now, finally, she has found a way to communicate what she saw, and you're suggesting I should silence her because her method is unconventional." The courtroom was absolutely still. "No, Mr. Morgan, I will not silence her. Emma Matthews deserves to be heard, and this court will hear her. If you want to appeal my decision, that's your right. But we are proceeding today, and we are proceeding now." Margaret turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Park, you may begin your examination." Park stood, straightening his tie, his hands trembling slightly. This was it. Everything they'd worked for, everything that mattered, came down to this moment. He approached the witness stand slowly, his voice gentle. "Emma, I know you're scared, but Detective Rodriguez is going to help you tell us what happened. Duke is going to be right there with you, and everyone in this room is listening. Can you tell us, in your own way, what you saw on the night of March 15th? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emma's hand, which had been still on Duke's head, began to move. Sarah Rodriguez's voice, clear and steady, filled the silent courtroom. "I was in my bedroom. It was late. I heard a noise downstairs." The testimony had begun. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward. In the jury box, 12 pairs of eyes fixed on the small girl and the dog. At the defense table, Michael Harrison's face had gone pale. And at the witness stand, Emma Matthews, silent for 9 months, finally began to speak her truth. History was being made. Emma's fingers moved through Duke's soft fur with deliberate precision, tracing shapes and patterns that had meaning, had weight, had the power to bring down a killer. Detective Sarah Rodriguez stood beside the witness stand, her eyes locked on Emma's small hand, her voice becoming the bridge between silence and justice. "I heard footsteps," Sarah translated, her tone steady despite the emotion churning in her chest. "Heavy footsteps, not Mama's or Daddy's, someone else." In the jury box, 12 people collectively leaned forward. This wasn't just testimony. This was a child reliving her nightmare in real time. Juror number 3, the school teacher, pressed a hand to her mouth. Juror number 7 gripped the armrest of his chair. Ada James Park stood several feet from the witness stand, giving Emma space, letting her story unfold at her own pace. "Emma, what did you do when you heard the footsteps?" Emma's hand paused for just a moment, then continued its movement through Duke's fur. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, his eyes half closed, as if he understood that his job was simply to exist, to be solid and real and safe. "I got scared," Sarah translated. "I went to my closet. I hid behind my dress-up clothes. I left the door open just a little bit so I could see." The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear the heating system humming through the vents. Outside, traffic moved past the courthouse, the world continuing as normal while inside this room, time seemed to have stopped. "What did you see, Emma?" Park asked gently. Emma's fingers moved faster now, more urgently. Sarah watched carefully, translating each sign as it formed. "I saw Mr. Harrison come up the stairs. He had a red can, the one from his garage, the gas can with the big dent on the side." At the defense table, Michael Harrison's attorney placed a warning hand on his client's arm. Harrison's face had gone from pale to flushed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Park pulled out a photograph previously entered into evidence. "Emma, is this the Ken you saw?" Emma's eyes flicked to the photograph, a red gasoline can recovered from the burned house with a distinctive dent on its right side. Her hand moved through Duke's fur. Sarah translated, "Yes." "What did Mr. Harrison do with the can?" The small hand trembled slightly, but Emma kept signing. "He poured it everywhere, in the hallway, on Mama and Daddy's bedroom door. He poured it down the stairs. I could smell it. Like when Daddy fills the lawn mower. It made my nose burn." Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. The details were too specific, too visceral to be fabricated. This wasn't a coached story. This was memory, raw and terrible. "Where were your parents, Emma?" Park's voice was soft, careful. Emma's hand stilled completely. Duke, sensing her distress, made a soft sound and pressed his head more firmly against her leg. For several long seconds, Emma didn't move at all. Then, slowly, her fingers began to trace signs again. "Mama was screaming. She was in their bedroom. She was screaming for me. 'Emma, Emma, where are you?' But I was too scared to answer. I stayed in the closet." Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the translation, but she pushed through. In the gallery, Mrs. Chen openly wept. Professor Linda Chen, the ASL expert, nodded grimly from her position, confirming the accuracy of the translation. "I heard Daddy's voice," Sarah continued, translating Emma's signs. "He was yelling at Mr. Harrison. He said, 'What are you doing? Michael, what are you doing?' And Mr. Harrison said." Emma's hand stopped again. Her whole body was shaking now, tremors running through her small frame. Duke stood up, pressing his entire body against the witness stand, offering his full presence. Emma's hand found his fur again, gripping it tightly before the signing resumed. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she translated. "Mr. Harrison said, 'You should have kept your mouth shut, David. You should have just taken the money and kept quiet.' Then I heard. Emma couldn't continue. Her hand moved frantically through Duke's fur, not signing, just seeking comfort. Park started to speak, to offer a break, but Emma's hand suddenly moved with sharp, angry gestures. "I heard Mama scream," Sarah translated, tears now streaming down her own face. "Then nothing. Then just Mr. Harrison's footsteps going back down the stairs." The courtroom was utterly silent, except for the sound of muffled crying from the gallery. Park's hands were shaking as he held his notes. "Emma, what happened next?" "I heard clicking, like the stove when Mama lights it. Then I smelled smoke. Then I saw orange light at the bottom of my door. The fire came so fast." "What did you do?" "I stayed in the closet. I got down low like they teach us at school. I put my dress-up princess dress over my face because of the smoke, and I waited." "Did you see Mr. Harrison again?" Emma's fingers moved with terrible certainty through Duke's fur. "Yes, I went to my window. I could see through the smoke. He was outside on the sidewalk, just standing there, watching." Park felt his heart hammering. What was he doing? Sarah translated Emma's signs, and her voice was hard as steel. "Smiling. He was smiling." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. In the jury box, juror number 5, a retired nurse, shook her head in disbelief and disgust. "Emma," Park continued, pressing forward, "did Mr. Harrison call for help? Did he try to save your parents?" The small hand moved decisively. "No, he just watched. He stood there for a long time, then he walked away." "Did he call 911? "Not until later, much later. I could hear the sirens after a long time, but he was already gone." Park pulled out phone records. "Emma, these records show Mr. Harrison called 911 at 11:47 p.m. Neighbors called at 11:13 p.m. Does that sound right?" Emma's hand moved. "Yes." "Your Honor," Park said, turning to Judge Thornton, I'd like to enter these phone records as Exhibit 23. So entered, Margaret replied, her voice tight. Park turned back to Emma. Emma, is there anything else that helps you know it was Mr. Harrison you saw? Emma's hand moved through Duke's fur with careful precision. Sarah watched, then translated. His tattoo, on his left arm, the snake eating its own tail. I saw it when he poured the gasoline. The hall light was on. I saw it clearly. The prosecution had never released that detail publicly. Only the investigators knew about Harrison's distinctive Ouroboros tattoo, a snake consuming itself in an eternal circle, inked on his left forearm. No further questions, Your Honor, Park said quietly. Judge Thornton looked at the defense table. Mr. Morgan, your witness. Defense attorney Richard Morgan stood slowly. He'd been furiously taking notes, watching Emma's every movement, looking for inconsistencies, for anything he could use. But as he approached the witness stand and saw this tiny, traumatized child with her hand buried in a dog's fur, he knew he was walking a razor's edge. Attack too hard and the jury would hate him. Too soft and his client was doomed. Emma, he began carefully, I know this is difficult. But before he could continue, the courtroom doors burst open. The courtroom doors slammed open with a bang that made everyone jump. A young clerk stumbled in, red-faced and apologetic, carrying a stack of documents that had apparently been urgently requested by the defense. Judge Thornton's glare could have melted steel. This better be life or death, she said icily. Sorry, Your Honor, the clerk stammered, rushing the papers to Morgan's table before practically fleeing the courtroom. The brief interruption had shattered the emotional intensity of the moment, but it had also given defense attorney Richard Morgan a few precious seconds to collect himself. He glanced at the documents, additional character witness statements, then set them aside. They wouldn't help. Nothing could help now except discrediting this child's testimony. He turned back to Emma, softening his expression, making his voice as gentle as possible. Emma, I know you've been through something terrible. No one is questioning that. But I need to ask you some questions about that night, okay? Emma's hand remained buried in Duke's fur. She didn't look at Morgan, didn't acknowledge him at all. Emma, it was nighttime, correct? And there was smoke. Her fingers moved slowly. Sarah Rodriguez translated, yes. So it was dark and there was smoke. That must have made it hard to see clearly, didn't it? Emma's response came through Sarah's translation. The hall light was on, I could see. Morgan nodded, packing slowly. But you were scared, weren't you? Terrified, in fact. And when we're scared, sometimes our minds play tricks on us. Sometimes we remember things that didn't quite happen the way we think they did. Objection, Park stood. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained, Judge Thornton ruled. Mr. Morgan asked questions. Morgan adjusted his approach. Emma, you said you saw Mr. Harrison's tattoo, but he was wearing long sleeves that night, wasn't he? It was March, still cold. Emma's fingers moved with certainty. Sarah translated. He pushed his sleeves up. I saw the snake clearly. You're sure about that? Yes. Morgan pulled out a photo from the crime scene investigation, showing Harrison in his interview with police the next day, wearing a long-sleeved button-down shirt. The police report says Mr. Harrison came to the station wearing this shirt, sleeves buttoned at the wrists. Does that match what you remember seeing? Emma's hand paused, then moved again. He changed clothes before the police came. I saw him in different clothes during the fire. Morgan's jaw tightened. The child had an answer for everything. He changed tactics. Emma, you said you heard Mr. Harrison say something to your father about money, about keeping quiet. But you also said there was a lot of noise, your mother screaming, the fire starting. How could you hear clearly? I heard it. Are you absolutely certain those were his exact words? Not just words that sound similar, not something you might have misremembered. Emma's fingers moved faster, more agitated. Sarah translated, her voice carrying Emma's rising distress. "I know what I heard. He said Daddy should have kept quiet. He said Daddy should have taken the money." "But Emma," Morgan pressed, sensing a possible opening, "you're 7 years old. Do you even understand what that means? Do you know what kind of money they might have been talking about?" At the prosecution table, Park tensed, ready to object, but Emma's response came before he could. Sarah translated, "The missing money, from the company. Daddy found out Mr. Harrison was stealing from the insurance company. Daddy told him he was going to tell the police. That's why Mr. Harrison killed them." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked down. Morgan's face flushed. "Your Honor," moved to strike. "The witness is speculating about motives she couldn't possibly." "The witness is testifying to what she heard," Park interjected. "The financial investigation is already part of our evidence. FBI forensic accountants have documented $1.2 million missing from Harrison and Matthews' insurance over 3 years. At the defense table, Michael Harrison's carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. His attorney had told him to stay calm, to look sympathetic, to never react. But hearing his crimes laid out by this child, this witness who should have died in that fire, was breaking through his control. Morgan soldiered on, though he could feel the case slipping through his fingers like sand. "Emma, isn't it possible that someone else started the fire? Someone who looked like Mr. Harrison? It was dark, there was smoke." "It was him." Emma's signs were emphatic now. "I saw his face, I saw his tattoo, I heard his voice. It was Mr. Harrison." "But you were traumatized, in shock. You haven't spoken in 9 months. Isn't it possible that your trauma has confused your memories, that you've convinced yourself?" "Objection." Park was on his feet, badgering the witness. "Sustained. Mr. Morgan, move on." But Morgan was running out of options. He looked at Emma, this tiny 7-year-old with her hand on a dog, this child who should have been easy to discredit, whose unconventional testimony should have been his golden ticket to reasonable doubt. Instead, she sat there with unshakable certainty, her signs consistent, her details damning. He made one last attempt. "Emma, do you know what happens if you lie under oath? Do you understand that telling the truth means?" "That's enough." The voice came from the defense table, but it wasn't Morgan's. Michael Harrison stood abruptly, his chair screeching backward. His face was no longer pale, it was crimson with rage. His attorney grabbed his arm, hissing warnings, but Harrison shook him off. "She's a liar," Harrison shouted, pointing at Emma. "She's just a traumatized kid who doesn't know what she saw. There was smoke everywhere. She couldn't have seen clearly, "Mr. Harrison, sit down," Judge Thornton commanded, her gavel hammering. But Harrison was past controlling himself. 9 months of maintaining his innocent facade, of playing the grieving business partner, of pretending to care about David Matthews and his family, all of it shattered in one explosive moment. "I didn't kill anyone. This is ridiculous. You're going to take the word of a child who can't even speak, who's signing through a dog. This whole trial is a circus." "Mr. Harrison," Morgan was on his feet now, trying to physically restrain his client. "Stop talking." But Harrison couldn't stop. The pressure of maintaining his lies, of keeping his mask in place, had built up like steam in a pressure cooker, and now it was erupting. She was supposed to, he caught himself, but too late. The courtroom had heard it. The jury had heard it. She was supposed to what? Supposed to die, supposed to be silent forever. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. "Bailiff," Judge Thornton stood, her voice booming, "restrain the defendant." 2 bailiffs moved toward Harrison, but he stepped back, still shouting. "You want to know the truth? The truth is David Matthews was going to ruin everything. Years of work, years of building that company, and he was going to throw it all away over some accounting discrepancies. He wouldn't listen to reason. Michael, shut up." Morgan was practically screaming now. "Shut up right now." Harrison's wild eyes found Emma. The little girl sat frozen in the witness stand, Duke pressed against her legs, her hand motionless in his fur. And Harrison, looking at her, felt something break inside him, the final wall between control and confession. "You should have died in that fire," he said, his voice suddenly cold and clear. "You should have died with your parents." The courtroom exploded. Judge Thornton's gavel came down again and again. "Order! Bailiffs, remove the defendant. Mr. Morgan, control your client." But it was too late. Michael Harrison had just confessed, not in words perhaps, but in rage, in the venom of his voice, in the murderous look he'd directed at a 7-year-old child. The jury sat in stunned silence, several members with their mouths literally hanging open. Juror number 3, the schoolteacher, was openly crying. Juror number 7 looked like he wanted to jump the partition and attack Harrison himself. As the bailiffs grabbed Harrison's arms, he seemed to suddenly realize what he'd done. His face went from red to white in an instant. "Wait, I didn't mean, that's not what I—" "Get him out of here," Judge Thornton ordered. As Harrison was dragged from the courtroom, still protesting, still trying to take back words that couldn't be taken back, Emma sat perfectly still. Her hand hadn't moved from Duke's fur. Her eyes remained downcast. But Sarah Rodriguez, standing beside her, saw something she hadn't seen in 9 months. The tiniest hint of a smile on Emma's lips. The monster had finally shown his true face. And justice was about to be served. The jury deliberation room on the 3rd floor of Jefferson County Courthouse was cramped and stuffy, with barely enough space for 12 chairs around a rectangular table. But the jury didn't need much time. They didn't need to review evidence or debate reasonable doubt. They had all seen the same thing: a man lose control and reveal his guilt in a courtroom full of witnesses. 90 minutes, that's how long it took them to come back. When the bailiff's phone rang with the news that a verdict had been reached, Judge Margaret Thornton felt her heart skip. She'd presided over hundreds of trials, heard countless verdicts, but this one felt different. This one mattered in a way that transcended legal procedure. The courtroom filled quickly. News had spread through the courthouse, then to the reporters outside, then across social media. A verdict in the case where a child testified through sign language and a dog, where a defendant had his breakdown captured by every sketch artist in the room. Emma sat in the gallery now, no longer at the witness stand. Mrs. Chen held her close on one side while Detective Sarah Rodriguez sat on the other, Duke lying calmly at their feet. Emma's hand rested on the dog's head, fingers slowly moving through his fur. Not signing anymore, just seeking comfort. Michael Harrison was brought back in, wearing handcuffs now. The confident businessman who'd walked into the courthouse that morning was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged 10 years in a single day. His attorney sat beside him, his expression that of a man who'd already accepted defeat. "All rise." Judge Thornton entered, her robe settling around her as she took her seat. The courtroom rose and fell like a wave. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The jury foreman, a postal worker named Gerald Hayes who'd been juror number 7, stood. His hands shook slightly as he held the verdict form. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" Gerald's voice was steady despite his trembling hands. "In the matter of the People versus Michael James Harrison, on the count of first-degree murder of David Matthews, we find the defendant guilty." Mrs. Chen's hand flew to her mouth. Sarah closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "On the count of first-degree murder of Sarah Matthews, we find the defendant guilty." Emma's fingers stilled in Duke's fur. "On the count of attempted murder of Emma Matthews, we find the defendant guilty." "On the count of first-degree arson, we find the defendant guilty." Gerald continued through all 7 counts. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling for the dead. Harrison sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. No outburst this time. No protests. Just the empty silence of a man who destroyed lives and now faced the consequences. Judge Thornton polled the jury individually, each confirmed their verdict, then set sentencing for 6 weeks hence. But everyone in that courtroom knew what it would be. Colorado had the death penalty, and this case screamed for it. Even if the sentence was life without parole, Michael Harrison would die in prison. "Court is adjourned," Margaret announced, her gavel falling with finality. As the courtroom emptied, as reporters rushed to file their stories and lawyers packed their briefcases, Emma sat still in the gallery. Duke's head rested on her lap now, his warm weight grounding her to reality. Judge Thornton, removing her robes in her chambers, looked out the window at the little girl and felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in her 23 years on the bench. Justice had been served, but what Emma had lost could never be returned. 3 months later. The paperwork took time. Background checks, psychological evaluations, training certifications. But Detective Sarah Rodriguez was determined. She'd worked with Duke for 3 years, loved him like family, but she loved justice more. And Emma needed Duke more than the police department did. Duke's official retirement ceremony was small and dignified. The police chief presented him with a medal for service, and Sarah held his leash for the last time as his handler. Then she knelt down, looked into those intelligent brown eyes, and whispered, "You've got a new job now, buddy, the most important one." Emma was there with Mrs. Chen, watching nervously. When Sarah brought Duke over and placed the leash in Emma's small hand, the girl looked up with wide eyes. "He's yours now," Sarah said gently. "Your service dog, your friend, your protector." Emma's hand tightened on the leash. Duke sat beside her, pressed against her leg, exactly where he belonged. 6 months after the trial. Mrs. Chen's house was small but warm, filled with the love of a woman who'd fostered 17 children over 15 years. Emma had her own room now, painted lavender at her request, the first choice she'd made about anything since the fire. Duke slept on a dog bed beside her human bed, though most nights Emma's hand would dangle over the side, fingers resting in his fur even in sleep. The nightmares still came. The therapy continued. But slowly, gradually, Emma was finding her way back to the world of the living. She attended a new school where understanding teachers gave her space and time. She sat in the back row with Duke beside her, still silent, still signing when she needed to communicate. But she was there. She was trying. 8 months after the trial. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. Sunshine streamed through the kitchen windows of Mrs. Chen's house. The foster mother was making pancakes, Emma's favorite, while Emma sat at the kitchen table, working on a coloring book. Duke lay at her feet as always. Mrs. Chen had learned to read Emma's moods, her needs, through gestures and expressions. They developed their own language of understanding. It was enough. "Duke needs to go out," Mrs. Chen said, flipping a pancake. "Would you let him into the backyard, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, setting down her crayon. She walked to the back door, Duke following eagerly. In the yard, she found his favorite tennis ball, worn and slobbery and perfect. She picked it up, wound her arm back, and threw it as hard as she could. Duke took off like a shot, his powerful legs eating up the distance. He caught the ball mid-bounce, shook it triumphantly, and trotted back to Emma with his tail wagging. Emma took the ball from his mouth, preparing to throw it again. Duke sat obediently, his eyes locked on the ball, his entire body quivering with anticipation. And then it happened. "Good boy, Duke." The words came out small and rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years, but they came out. Emma's eyes widened in shock at the sound of her own voice. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Chen's hands froze mid-flip, the pancake forgotten. "Good boy," Emma said again, her voice growing stronger. Tears began streaming down her face, not tears of fear or sadness, but of release, of breaking through, of coming back. Duke's tail wagged harder. He made a soft, happy sound. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, her own face wet with tears, her hands pressed to her mouth. Emma looked at her foster mother, at this woman who'd given her a home when she had nothing, who'd been patient through 9 months of silence, who'd loved her without condition. "Hi," Emma whispered. Mrs. Chen crossed the yard in 3 steps, dropping to her knees and pulling Emma into a fierce hug. Duke danced around them both, sensing the joy, the breakthrough, the miracle of this moment. They stayed like that for a long time, woman, child, and dog, crying and laughing in the sunshine. The silence had finally, truly broken. 1 year later. Emma Matthews stood in Judge Thornton's courtroom one more time, but this time it was different. This time she wore a pretty yellow dress and held Mrs. Chen's hand tightly. Duke sat beside her, wearing a bow tie for the occasion. "Emma," Judge Margaret said with a warm smile, "do you understand what's happening today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Emma's voice was still soft, still careful, but it was there. "Mrs. Chen is adopting me." "That's right, and how do you feel about that?" Emma looked up at the woman who'd become her mother in every way that mattered. "Happy," she said simply. Margaret's gavel came down gently. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Colorado, I hereby grant this petition for adoption. Emma Matthews, you are now legally and forever Emma Chen. Congratulations to you both." Mrs. Chen, now simply Mom, pulled Emma into a hug while the small audience in the courtroom applauded. Sarah Rodriguez was there, wiping her eyes. Dr. Morrison, the psychologist who'd never given up on Emma, was beaming. Even the bailiff looked misty. As they left the courtroom, Emma paused at the door and looked back at Judge Thornton. "Thank you," she said clearly, "for letting Duke stay with me, for letting me tell the truth." Margaret smiled, feeling tears threaten again. "You're very welcome, Emma. You were so brave." Emma shook her head. "Duke was brave, I just held on." Sometimes Judge Margaret Thornton would reflect later, that's all any of us can do. Hold on to whatever gives us strength, whatever keeps us grounded, whatever helps us find our voice. For Emma, that had been a German shepherd with patient eyes and a gentle heart. And it had been enough.